Today we're going to talk about the first test statistic of Unit 3. So we are doing another test statistic, another hypothesis test with a p-value, but there's 3 different test statistics that you're going to learn this unit. So we are testing something called the hot hand. And it may sound kind of weird, but the more you hear it, the more you're going to start to hear it on TV. So for example, like I was watching a sports game and all of a sudden, I heard like, oh, he's got the hot hand. And it sounded so strange to me when I learned it the first time for stat reasoning, or when I taught it the first time. But then when you start to hear it more and more, it's kind of like, oh, this is actually a relevant thing in sports. So to have the hot hand means that a player's ability is higher following a success than following a failure. So for example, if we say that someone has a hot hand bowling, that means if a player gets a strike, they're more likely to get a strike the second time. So if a player has a success, they're more likely to have a success the second time. So if you get a strike, you're more likely to get a strike again immediately after. So you have a higher chance of getting a success after a success. So Michael Jordan has a greater ability to make a second free throw when he's previously made the first free throw. So greater ability, we can also say now a shortened hypothesis, Michael Jordan has the hot hand. And you might see something saying Michael Jordan is streaky. Both mean that there is a higher percent after a success than after a failure. So this sounds like a lot like our alternative hypothesis. So you can say either of these for the alternative hypothesis this time. Hot hand meaning a greater ability after a success to get a success. And we can also just state that, a greater ability to make a second free throw when you've previously made the first one. Okay, and now we have something called independent. A player's ability to be successful is the same regardless if they got a success or if they got a failure. So if we're talking about a student's ability to be independent, that means you might fail a test. You're no more likely to fail or pass the next test. Or if you get an A, you're not more likely to get an A or fail the next time. Each actual independent trial is independent of the next trial. So if you get a test, it has no influence on the next test. So we say here, Michael Jordan has the same ability to make a second free throw, whether or not he's made the first one. We can also say for this hypothesis, Michael Jordan is independent. This sounds a lot like our null hypothesis. So we use the phrase independent for the null, and we use the phrase hot hand or streaky for the alternative. Okay, so there's 3 test statistics like I said earlier. The first one is called the longest streak. The next one is the number of streaks. And the third one is the percentage of success. And this one is a lot like our Unit 2 hypothesis. All right, so what we're going to talk about is the longest streak. So when you have the longest streak, this is your first test statistic. You're going to have to be able to differentiate between the 3. We want to see if you're more likely to have a success after a success. You would literally just count the longest streak in the actual order. And you can count a longest streak when we have a failure after a failure as well. So the longest streak is going to be your test statistic. So here's an example. Does Tony Romo have the hot hand? So in his 2008 September 7th game, quarterback Tony Romo of the Dallas Cowboys, he had 9 consecutive completed passes. So the C's represented the completed passes, and the I's represented the incomplete passes. You should kind of be thinking here, okay, I could simulate this with note cards. Think about how could you simulate this with note cards. So all you would do is you'd count the number of streaks. So here, this is our 9. I like to go through and just count every one just in case. So like here I had 3, here I had 3, but 9 is obviously the greatest one. That means that my test statistic is 9. For your null hypothesis, we're using that phrasing independent. So I would say Tony Romo pass completions are independent. And that means, again, he has the same ability to get a success following a success. So he has the same ability to get a completion after getting a previous completion or a non-completion. For the alternative, we're going to use that hot hand language. So Tony Romo has the hot hand. Again, that sounds really weird, but it is just a claim to say that he has a greater ability to get a completion after he's previously gotten a completion. And now we're going to go ahead and conduct the test. So this should look fairly familiar. So recall our test statistic was 9. That was his longest streak. To find the p-value, we find 9 on the dot plot, and we count how many dots are on or but, because we're stating that he has a greater ability to get a success after a success. So now give me like 50 minutes to count all these dots. Just kidding, but let me count them real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got 38. So I have 38 dots out of 100, meaning my p-value is 0.38. When we interpret, we always assume that the null hypothesis. So assuming Tony Romo's past completions are independent, there is a 38% chance of getting a longest streak of 9 or more by random chance. So a lot of that similar language that we looked at last unit, but this time my actual test statistic is the longest streak. So you want to specify that the longest streak is 9. So before we were talking about the difference in proportion, but now we're talking about a longest streak. For your conclusion, your p-value is greater than 0.05. That means random chance is a plausible explanation. Therefore, we failed to reject the null hypothesis, and we have evidence that he is an independent pass completer. That Tony Romo's passes were independent. All right, so looking through this, you're going to work on some extra practice questions. So make sure that you practice, you look up some information, and you understand the longest streak is just counting the number of successes, the longest number of successes.